Welcome to the podcast, Cadell. Nice to have you.
Great to be here, man. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, this is amazing. So it feels aligned to start just diving straight into it. Sometimes I ask like background. I feel like almost just diving into the actual content will give a better picture of your work and what you do, because that's what we'll be talking about probably the whole podcast. And so I wanted to start out with just exploring philosophy in general. So personally, I have this feeling of philosophy is fascinating to me, but there's very few people that I speak about it. I don't get this feedback of, oh, that's so disembodied. That's so airy fairy up in the clouds. What does that have anything to do with the world? Like we were speaking about this before the podcast, and it's like, this is literally the exact feeling that I have almost anytime I share philosophy. It's almost like in our modern culture, I'm sensing that almost like 99% of people that I say the word philosophy to, the gut reaction is like, what does that have? That has nothing to do. Like, why would you even do that? Just do science, bro. Like, like, why would you do philosophy? It's just, you're just being lost and thinking. And it's kind of this, it feels like there's this stereotype of like just armchair philosophy. You know, you're just sitting at home all day, just thinking about stuff that has no grounding whatsoever. And I've struggled to actually like find words for why that's not the case, because in my being, it's like, well, no, that's not the case. Philosophy is the most fundamental thing possible, right? It's like, what is self? That is philosophy. You can't, everything you're doing in the world is based on various philosophical groundings. And so if you're not doing philosophy, you're just taking the default philosophy of whatever culture you're in or wherever you grew up in or whatever family structure you're in. And so like philosophy for me is like, well, let's like take a step back. What are the assumptions I'm making about myself, about the world, about how all these different dynamics work? And without that, it's just like, well, then I'm just going to be given defaults. And like, why would I just want to live on defaults without actually looking into them? So I'm curious what that brings up for you in terms of how is philosophy seen as disembodied and airy fairy in your what you've been exploring recently? What are some ways that philosophy can be embodied, grounded, and just super accessible in every moment of life, I guess?
Sure, man. Yeah, I really resonate with what you're saying, first to start off with. And I think it's really a product of our era that we have this sort of impression of philosophy, let's say, that it's extremely disembodied, and it doesn't have sort of contact with day-to-day life. And paradoxically, when I sort of came to philosophy, it was precisely because of problems of embodiment and problems of very practical things in my life. Like I could like to describe things like how you were saying, questioning defaults and sort of taking a step back. We could use complex philosophical jargon like Kant's a priori categories, right? Like, because if you think about questioning defaults and taking a step back, that's really what Kant's talking about when he talks about a priori categories and questioning the a priori categories. Now, we don't have to use those. We don't have to use that philosophical jargon because immediately people's eyes are going to glaze over. Right. But what philosophy is precisely what you're saying, is recognizing that a lot of the thinking that is going on inside your mind on a day-to-day basis is kind of default mode programming, and philosophy is kind of taking a step back. And it's saying, like a lot, like when I entered into philosophy, what I did was I stopped acting in some sense, not to stop acting permanently, but to question more my actions and to think through more my actions and to really see how the things I was acting out were being mediated by thoughts that were not my own. And to question these thought processes more deeply, and to sort of get a clearer view of myself. And in that sense, I think philosophy just brings us to, I say philosophy brings us to thinking the 24-hour cycle of ourself and seeing that as the primary material we're working with. Like that's what we're working with. We're not escaping that loop. Like, what is a 24, like, let me just not even like putting on some sort of pre-programmed podcast form of discourse. Like, I'm just thinking right now, coming up spontaneously in my mind. I can't escape the 24-hour loop of myself. The 24-hour loop is a metaphor for a loop we could describe otherwise. But I wake up, I'm awake for a period, I get sleepy, I go to sleep for a period, I wake up, and this loop just repeats and repeats and repeats. And what's happening during that loop? Am I really thinking about everything that's going on in that loop? What am I not thinking about that's going on in that loop? Right? What am I avoiding thinking about that's going on in that loop? Right? This is philosophy, and the greatest philosophers are people who have created a singularly unique loop. Like if you take an Aristotle, or you take a Parmenides, or you take a Diogenes, these are all very strange loops. and the point of throwing oneself and submitting oneself, it does take, I think, an act of submission to submit oneself to philosophy. It's not that you ever copy another philosopher's loop, but it's to recognize that you are a strange loop, and that by really thinking it, you'll become something that the world's never seen, potentially.
Yeah, and I have this sense, I'm talking about like waking up in the morning. All right, I'm waking up, like, what am I waking up as? Like, who is waking up? How am I going about my day-to-day life? And then what I'm getting, this common thread, is like experience. Like, what is your experience in any single given moment? What is your experience of, because I think we have these assumptions of like, all right, this is my experience, this is what it is, this is what's going on, this is what's real, this is who I am. And this is filtering our experience in every single moment. And so I go back to like phenomenology, and you brought up at the beginning, like, when I wake up in the morning, it's philosophy. When I eat my breakfast, it's philosophy. Like every single like action we take can be a philosophical act in some sort. And so how can we ground philosophy in just our experience of just like going about our day-to-day lives? And I'm approaching it from this angle of like, I just have this feeling of like every single experience I'm having is being filtered by something. And so how I'm understanding it is philosophy is becoming aware of what is actually filtering every single experience, and not optimizing. Sounds like a too scientific word, but like rethinking and looking at different ways to potentially filter experience that can arrive at different ontologies and different ways of understanding self and acting as self in the world. And so it's almost like, how can we embody philosophy in a way in which what we're acting as, the self that we're acting as, we're acting in the world and interacting with the world in a fundamental way every single day. And so, yeah, what is that process of like, all right, like making every single act a philosophical act, as in, all right, I'm going to go out and get groceries, I'm going to go do this, I'm interacting with people in this way. What is like the philosophical ontological act there?
But the act, so the act is like, what is it that when talking about getting up in the morning or going to get groceries or something like that, what's the difference between someone acting that out unconsciously, and what's the difference between someone acting that out philosophically? So in order for me to do that, I kind of have to offer I think that, I would argue that philosophers should do this more, is as a philosopher, I'll offer myself up as an object. So some of the things well, first off, before I offer myself up as an object, I'll say that what I do with these basic experiences is simply engage in the act of constant self-questioning. I'm constantly questioning, and I'm constantly being perplexed by common things. So things that are just common, things that are just everyday, like going to the grocery store, like waking up, I'm questioning, and I'm being perplexed. Like, even, for example, meeting a random person or talking to it, I bump into someone randomly, and there's a spontaneous conversation there. By being puzzled by it, being interested in it, bringing my awareness to it, and questioning, meaning inquiring about it, not presupposing that I know what's really happening here. Now, if I offer myself up as an object, and I offer myself to you and to the listeners about what I'm questioning about in myself, one of the things that I question about myself is that over the last few years, I've recognized that when I wake up in the morning, it's quite easy for me to wake up in the morning and almost feel kind of serene, feel kind of so you're talking about experience, I'm talking about the quality of my experience. So I feel kind of it's easy for me to wake up and almost, take a cold shower and then go into a meditation. And I can fall into that quite easily with little resistance and little friction, and I have little inner turmoil. But then I have a question, because when I continue to observe myself throughout the day and I start to watch myself as I prepare for bed, I notice that the quality of my experience as I prepare for bed is different. Meaning, even though I'm serene in the morning, when I'm preparing for bed, I don't feel serene. When I'm preparing for bed, I feel annoyed. I feel an inner friction. I feel almost tormented sometimes. And the more I look into what that feeling is about, it's kind of like I have this feeling come over me that there's an excitement that wasn't fulfilled, or that there's something more that should happen. Right. So oftentimes I'll talk about this in, like, whether it's, with circling, or whether it's with, just opening up with friends personally. I have this need, for example, to eat like junk food at night or something like that. Right. Because it's like trying to satisfy like an excitation that I feel hasn't been met in the day. That's my interpretation of it. It's also that when I'm going to sleep, it's kind of like the act of falling asleep is kind of like an act of submission. Like my ego has to submit to becoming unconscious. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like I have to shut myself off, and it's like my ego's like, I don't want to shut off. Like I want to stay up, or I want to do something more. Right. So like, I hope that's a good example of what I mean when I say, like, I'm thinking about things that are very close to us, right? Like waking up and going to sleep. But just by paying attention to the quality of those states. Now that's my loop, right? Because I'm not saying everyone has that pattern. What's the quality of your waking and sleeping loop, and also that's the quality of my loop right now. And the practical aspect of philosophy is, by being questioning about this loop, well, I can use myself as a scientific object. Like, why is it that the structure of my experience is like that right now? What is it about my day-to-day life that I could change so that loop could be adjusted in some way? What is it that my loop is, there's a crook in it. There's a twist in it that I'm trying to think.
This brings up a couple things. I love how you framed being perplexed by everyday things. That really caught my eye. I've spoken to a couple people about this, but this is, I feel, my current drive for philosophy has been like this. Going throughout the day-to-day life, most the default ways. Like, I'm gonna go to the grocery store, get some groceries. I've seen this grocery store 100 times. I've seen these things 100 times. I'm going to the grocery store, getting them, leaving, and I get to be back home and whatever. Then all is good. For me, like the philosophical ways, like, all right, I'm driving down the street, I'm arriving at the grocery store, I'm looking at the foods, having all these interactions, and everything is just like, it's like this yearning to see it for the first time almost. I want to be driving down the street feeling like I've never, just like fully in awe at like just the phenomenological experience and that I'm experiencing in every single moment. Like what is this? What is experiencing this right now, or what is being experienced right now? And that's always like the questioning in my head is like, right, yeah, like what is going on? Like what is, like, just awareness, experience, like what is witnessing is a lot of times the question that I arrive at. And I wanted to, there's something else you said there that I wanted to dive into as well, which was,
If you're while you're thinking, I can sort of say just quickly as an aside that there's something very profound about wanting to experience something as if for the first time, or as if it's brand new.
you can,
Like you're saying, and that's actually how that, I mean, to bring it to sort of like a, I think about philosophers as kind of like an anchoring point in thinking. That's something that Freud highlighted, was that when we think about desire and we think about the object of desire, oftentimes what structures the object of desire is this desire to experience it as if for the first time. And a melancholic state, or a melancholic emotional state, is this feeling as if you'll never experience anything new again, or you'll never experience it like it was for the first time.
right.
Like you can think about that, like for a romantic relationship, for example, like I'll never feel the way it was the first time. That would be like a melancholic relationship to that desire. Or like, or your favorite food. I'll never experience it like I did when I was a kid. Like, for example.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's almost this dropping of concepts. It's like, oh, this is a street, this is the grocery store, that's what that thing is, I know what those things are, versus like the specificity is like lost, right? Versus like, all right, this street is different than every other street, right? So what if I just like fully perceive this without like, oh, this is just a street, I've seen streets 100 times or something like this. And what was coming up, and it came to me as you were speaking, was it felt like what we were speaking at tied in with this what you speak on a lot, this lack. Like, all right, I go to bed at night in this excitation like hasn't been met. It's almost like what is that like lack? It's like, what is that? What is lacking of not fulfilling whatever expectations there were for the day, or with this feeling of melancholy or boredom of like, I feel like I'm not going to experience it for the first time again. What is that lack of, like, I feel in lack because I'm not experiencing everything as if for the first time. And that felt really present. I'm sure you could speak a bit on that.
Well, yeah, I was really motivated. I was really motivated to do the philosophy of lack, which is a series I'm sort of co-guiding with some other friends on my channel. So if people are interested in that, they can just YouTube that philosophy of lack. And what's behind that is actually like this feeling that's been with me since I was a child. The first time I remember having the feeling was actually like, I don't know if it's like displaced from an earlier feeling, but it was actually like around the time I was playing like Nintendo 64 and other like earlier video game systems, which was like this feeling of like reality being empty, or there being some emptiness about it, and that the video game was a type of like substitute excess. Like I just remember the experience of like my parents surprising me with the Nintendo 64 and it being such like an excessive joy. And like me and my brother just being like hooked to it and like it being so exciting. And then feeling like just this feeling like normal reality or my normal experience was somehow almost like made possible by the absence of that excess. Like in other words, like it's almost, and like when you're like really like, I can generalize this because it's not specifically related to video games. I have a memory that's like closely related to video games,
Right.
but it's more like when you're really, I think pulled is the right word. Like when you're really pulled by something, when you're really you might use the word like a flow state. Like when you're really in a flow with something.
Mm-hmm.
I also have the experience when I was playing sports. It's almost like my identity isn't there. But when I'm not in that flow state or when I'm not pulled by something, it's like my identity is kind of structured by a lack, or like that's how I experience it.
Yeah, I was gonna ask how that tied back into lack, because I guess I didn't understand it, and you tied it back in at the end there, which was like,
it's like those excesses are like forms of my lack. It's like that like clicked, that hit the spot. It's like kind of like there was a hole and that filled it.
It filled
like
it, and then you go immediately back to the lack. It's like a temporary fulfillment of that lack or wholeness.
It's always temporary. It's always temporary. At least, I mean, it is for me, and that's not necessarily a bad thing either, because like the more I've gone into lack has its own joy. Like, for example, that's something I've explored with either fasting, meditation, abstinence, things like there's various different practices that are mostly around restraint and lack. And those can be abused as well, but they're also sort of, they have their own joy.
Right. Yeah, there's something here I wanted to bring up with you, which was I was speaking about lack with our mutual friend, Daniel Gardner, and he brought up this point around we need lack, the necessity of lack, right? And I was like, is it ever possible to like have some sort of wholeness or fulfillment? Like, well, like how do we like fix this lack almost? Or like that was kind of the topic of the conversation. Or like, can you ever fix it? Or do you even want to fix it, right? And it's
now
almost
now you're being philosophical. Good.
And yes, I love it. And we're actually speaking about the creative process, going from finite or like creativity as like bringing the infinite into this finite, incomplete, lacking form, and always wanting to like move closer to this like formlessness, or in the creative process. And how it got brought up was like, is it possible to be in a state, because it's like a lack, as we were dialoguing about it, was coming up as lack is what propels us to continue creating. If we're not in a state of lack, then it's just like death, and then we just don't create, and then like nothing gets done because there's nothing actually propelling us to do anything at all. And so what I would love to bring up, what got brought up a little bit, but we just barely touched on it, was like wholeness versus lack, right? Is it possible to be in a state of wholeness with the feeling of lack, right? Is lack and wholeness polar opposites of each other, or are they like separate things where there's like incompleteness and wholeness on one side, and there's like lack and just like death and emptiness and nothingness on the other side? It's almost like, can you have this wholeness, this feeling of like not needing to change the lack in any way, shape, or form, and just being with the lack fully, and noticing that it's this valid feeling of propelling you into a greater expression of something?
Well, I think this is a good example, and this is something I'm always trying to improve my thinking on, I suppose, and it's a constant source of new thinking. Right now, I'm thinking about it like a dialectical relationship between lack and excess. So I think what like in the most extreme forms of either pole, you can say, and the most extreme sides of either pole would be non-dialectical, right? Like dialectical is sort of thinking about the coincidence of the opposites and their movement and their relationship with each other and their transformation, and we could go deeper into dialectics from that angle. But on the one hand, I think that wholeness with the WHOL, whole, rather than whole, which is HOLE. So if you have the wholeness with the WHOLE, I think that the most extreme form of wholeness is ideology. So it's trying, and so basically what I'm saying is that ideology is what the form of ideology is, that it's trying to create a one or a perfect circle that would get rid of lack. It's like a response to lack. It's like, I'm lacking, it's painful, or I don't like it, or feels empty, or I don't feel good about myself, or I don't feel at home in the world, or I feel melancholic, or I feel depressed, or could be a number of underlying negative emotional states. But the ideology is serving the desire not to think lack. So that would be the extreme end of wholeness. Now that's not saying wholeness is bad. It's not bad. It's just that's the extreme end of it. You can go the extreme end of lack. So like the extreme end of lack would be someone committing suicide, I think. Right? Like someone just saying, I want to kill myself, and doing it. Right? Like, I think they're both in some sense forms of death. One's a form of death that leads you to death itself. And the other is a form of death that's kind of like an idea death. It's kind of like a thinking death, because you just become ideological. And many people sort of enclose themselves very tightly in a certain ideology. And that in some sense structured many battles in the 20th century as well. It's not like it's gone away. There are other forms of extreme lack as well. Like I would say that someone who, like for example, anorexia. Like there are people who have anorexia nervosa as a condition, and they love not eating so much that they just become skin and bones. And that's another form of, it's like kind of it's kind of like the ideology of lack, you know. And you can also have other people like who, for example, they create entire religions over sex being bad, saying you can't have sex, right? Like sex is, or they put it under a certain constraint that's very intense, incredibly regulated. And I can tell stories about, you know, the types of weird regulations that people can put around that, but that's another form of an ideology of lack. Now, I'm trying to think that there's a dialectical relationship between lack and wholeness, like that it can be healthy. Like, for example, that I can really enjoy eating my favorite food, and I can really enjoy a 24-hour cycle of fasting. Right? Or like, you know, it's about like the level of awareness you're bringing to the relationship between lack and excess. That's how I'm trying to think it. And now you could apply, I gave the example of food, but you can give the example of many different things.
Right.
It's, and then, you know, is there an end to this dialectical relationship between lack and excess? I'm not sure, but that's kind of like, I don't know about you or the people listening, but when it comes to things like, you know, my sex drive, or my oral drive, or my my drive for adventure, or my drive for safety, or my drive for a number of different things, writing or creating, at least when I think about it, it's kind of like this dialectical relationship's interesting to think about.
Yeah, I'm getting this sense, and I think you spoke about, I heard this in one of the trialogue conversations you had. There's almost like it's perceiving it as almost this like dynamic equilibrium, right? Because at first, like my feeling was to want to think of it as like balance. Like, what is like the middle point you can find that balances out lack and wholeness, or ideology and death, or whatever the opposites are and the dualities are. It's like, what is like the balanced middle ground? And it almost sounds like it's not that there's one balanced middle point, but it almost feels like there's this dynamic balancing process that's always happening, right? And so in one side, you brought that up, the food example, one side you'll be eating a bunch of food, your favorite food, feel like yeah, you're kind of in the excess of food, and then you kind of go into the excess of fasting, and you're going on the other side, and it's kind of this constant. You never go all the way. You never go to the extreme excesses of lack or the extreme excesses of wholeness, but kind of the dynamic balancing of moving kind of in the middle grounds on each side, constantly back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and kind of just learning how to be in relationship with that dynamic process.
Yeah, I think like what you're I think what you're describing and like what's coming into my mind is like, that's kind of how I think about libido. Like what you're describing, and like I'm like thinking about it like you might describe it like a snake, or like it's an energy. It's like a snaking, slithering energy. So I don't know, like that's the image that was coming to my head when you were describing it anyway. Like, or it's some sort of like it's like a beast of energy, like it's, you know, and the thing is like let me go deeper into this. This is just coming out. I'm just thinking about this spontaneously, is like this beast of energy is like one of the things I've been appreciating in some of the papers I'm reading from Freud at the moment, is this idea that instincts are difficult for the mind because the mind doesn't control instincts, and the instincts are exerting a constant pressure. So like, in other words, like if someone wants to like make an ideology out of fasting, or if someone wants to make an ideology out of say not having sex, repressing their sex drive, it's kind of like the mind saying, I don't like that I don't control my instincts. Like there's this constant force of instinct, and I don't want to look at it. I don't want to accept it. I don't want to work with it. I want to fight against it and repress it and pretend it's not there, or demonize it. Mm-hmm. Right. So, but I think what this energy is at least in my life is something that I'm trying to develop a relationship with it. Like that, this is something that I'm riding. It's dynamic. It's a dynamic process. I do not control that I get hungry. I could meditate in a cave for 1,000,000 years and I'll still get hungry. Like I met a Buddhist monk one time when I went to a retreat where there were a lot of young people there, and he had been a Buddhist monk for several decades, and he leaned over to me and he was like, basically saying to me, you know, like there are a lot of attractive women here, you know, saying that he was being challenged inside of himself by the appearance of beautiful young women, right? But my point is just that it doesn't matter how long he was meditating and retreated from the world, that energy is still inside of him. So this energy is inside of us, and it's like kind of like the question to me, I guess the philosophical question is, what is the ethics of this energy? And that's an individual decision for every person, and that there's no necessarily right or wrong. It's not like good and bad, like here I'll name drop an anchor point again of Friedrich Nietzsche. Like when Nietzsche's talking about beyond good and evil, what he's really talking about is that we can't understand ourselves if we just moralize what we are. Like if we just say that's good, that's bad, in a simplistic binary, basically saying like, look at what the energy is. And like what the thing he was saying about evil, and he was saying basically that good and evil are like a continuum. And that like the energy that we call evil is actually an energy which, if you look at it and work with it, can produce the highest good. And like Freud actually echoed that point when he said that children who are engaged in activity that we consider as evil are often the same individuals who end up cultivating the highest good. So it's like being in touch with like your raw energy, being in touch with the energy that the social others find intimidating or scary, is at the same time the energy that can make you who you really are.
It almost seems like it goes the other way too. The ones that repress the evil a lot end up committing the most evil in the world.
Let's talk about Catholic priests as the most ridiculous example.
Right.
Like that's an archetypal example that everyone's going to know. That's an archetypal example that everyone's going to relate to, but it's the most ridiculous and it's the most absurd. But the Catholic priest is the highest image of good. They're supposed to be the ethical embodiment of the good.
Right.
And then there's a systemic problem in the Catholic Church that they're having sex with little boys, which is the most evil thing you could do.
Right.
So it's this is the reality we're working with, though. This is why these conversations are important. This is why philosophy is important, because these conversations are so important because we're talking about the energy. And or if we want to use the word energy, I mean, I like the word libido, but we're talking about a phenomenon where the most paradoxical behavior can be the consequence of thinking it or not thinking it. You know, using the ethics of this energy. And did I go for a sec?
Yeah, just for like 5 seconds, you talked about the ethics of this energy, then it cut out.
Yeah, so like in the context of our meeting, when we're talking about the ethics of this energy, I think we met in the context of basically a psychedelic retreat.
Right.
And like taking psychedelics doesn't mean that you can escape these problems. Shortage of, for example, shamans who I've heard have engaged in sexual abuse, like there's sexual abuse problems at certain psychedelic retreat centers. Right. So going off into the non-dual reality, let's say, that doesn't get you out of thinking these ethical problems of libido, let's say.
I think this is a good kind of to direct it into the masculinity dating conversation. That's really interesting. One is like, how do you define libido? Like life energy, that is, which is like invigorating life, or like I don't have a very solid understanding of libido as a yeah.
Okay, so let's first use an example that's very close to practical reality. So libido is when a child is born and the child's screaming and wailing. What does the child do and what does the child want?
When a child is born, screaming.
A child's screaming. There's a baby that's just been born that's screaming in your hand.
Yeah, it wants its mom. It wants food.
Yes.
It wants to be comforted. It wants to be loved.
Absolutely. So it's going to move right to the breast, to the mother, and it's going to stay there, right? That's the basic. Libido is a simple action. Libido is a simple pulsation. It's a simple repetition. Libido is like where, if you trace the ancient philosophical origin of how Freud talks about libido, he's basically talking about the active and the passive principle. So on its most basic, libido is the active principle of being. And the first action, and every human that's ever existed was born out of a mother. Right? And what's the first thing the baby does? The baby's, it's an impulse to the mother.
Mm-hmm.
Every single baby that's been born. So that's the libido at its origin. Now, before, when it's in the womb, there's energy there, and it's something different, and it's something that's like a coincidence between activity and passivity. Because the womb is like the fetus is passive. It's a passive recipient of nutrients,
mm-hmm.
and it moves, and it's active as well. But it's kind of like an environment that's kind of like all of your basic needs are kind of met automatically.
Right.
So libido is an active force. And Freud, so if we want to get into the ideology, there are obviously theoretical disagreements and debates about libido and how we can think about it. But that's sort of like the origin of at least how libido as a concept was used in psychoanalysis and thought. And then you can trace that back to earlier philosophical thinking about activity and passivity. And then traditionally, activity and passivity were stereotyped as masculine and feminine principles.
Right. Yeah, so it feels aligned to dive into this masculine, feminine dating arena. I wanted to surface it with, I found it fascinating. There's something that I wanted to dive into that I found super fascinating in one of your conversations, which was adventure and security, like that polarity.
Yes.
That polarity. I found that fascinating. And that's and how it came up for me. What I found most fascinating is, all right, we have these preconceived ideas of adventure and security in our society. Adventure being when you're single, you're out dating, you're just being adventurous, you're taking risks, and you're just in the state of like that's very attractive for a lot of people. And then there's the other side of like, all right, but that comes with fear, comes with potential isolation, potential loneliness. Then there's the security, which is like a marriage or something. And then you're in the marriage, but it comes with potential loneliness, or also loneliness, I guess, boredom, just like not uneventfulness. And I loved the reframing that from what I listened to.
A paradoxical reversal.
Right. That potentially the marriage or the long-term relationship can be the most adventurous one, because you were talking about something around the relationship stays the same, but the perception of other and the perception of what love is and what other is constantly dying and changing and being reborn. And this is like, it's never actually staying the same. And so that's actually very adventurous, right? If you've known someone for a year, but but how you're understanding them is radically changing a year later, 2 years later, that's quite adventurous, right?
Exactly. Like there's been a paradoxical reversal as it relates to this, and I think, yeah, you're pointing at it well. So the paradoxical reversal, as I understand it, is if you are engaged in what's conventionally thought of as adventurous, like you're single, you're constantly doing something new, you're dating a lot of people, you're having sex with multiple people, the paradox is that itself becomes repetitive boredom and kind of safety and security from deep feeling and deep emotion.
Right.
Like, so like the adventure becomes actually a safety mechanism, right? Like, because you're preventing yourself from really sacrificing yourself to love another person, which is actually adventurous and risky.
Right, what comes out of the deepest wells of our unconscious when we're in a long-term relationship is going to
Exactly.
be risky and scary, and
Yes.
that's adventurous.
Yeah, that's adventurous because if you're in a relationship with someone for 5 years, or if you're in a relationship with someone for 10 years, that's risky, because like it could end.
Mhm.
Like the other person could get bored with you, or the other person could change, or the other person could say, I don't love you anymore. So it's extremely risky. Right.
Investing 10 years and then
yeah,
poof, it's gone.
exactly. And a lot of people don't want to take that risk because it's actually putting their heart on the line.
Mm.
Right. So again, we have the ideology that it's actually adventurous to like sleep around and like have short-term relationships and stuff like that. And it's actually boring to be in a marriage, and that's safe and stuff like that. But it's kind of the opposite.
Yeah.
It's kind of the opposite. And I think that, you know, the proof of that is that in a conventional traditional marriage, there were very tight regulations over divorce. The reason why there were tight regulations over divorce was because it was so risky to be in a marriage.
Mm.
Otherwise, why would we have tight regulations on divorce?
Right.
Right. Like, so now the problem is that there's not tight regulations on divorce. So it's, again, there's a dialectical reversal. So now there's not tight regulations on divorce. So now it's obvious that it's super risky. So then a lot of people are like, well, I don't want to take that risk because my heart, I'm putting my heart on the line. But then the problem is that if you don't put your heart on the line, you become cold and your relationships are shallow.
Right.
Right. So again, this is where philosophy is important. and I recommend for anyone who like wants to really dive into this more, like, yeah, there's a conversation on my channel about dating, but there's also someone who's probably come up in the culture a lot recently named Esther Perel. And she wrote a book called Mating in Captivity, where she talks about one of the biggest problems for people who have been in long-term relationships is basically cultivating sexual desire and long-term love. So there's a paradox. There's basically a paradox between sexual desire and long-term love, where like you can love someone for 20 years and they can be your best friend and you can love them and you can like want to be around them. But oftentimes sexual desire requires sort of spontaneity and novelty and newness. And a lot of times in long-term relationships, couples struggle with how to reconcile that. So that's another philosophical problem. And that's another very emotionally difficult topic for a lot of people. So this is for me philosophy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Going back to where we started, how do you embody philosophy?
Yeah.
Here's one way to embody it. Here's one way to, within a relationship, I'm in a relationship, or say you're in a relationship and it's saying, yeah, how do we understand this relationship? How do we understand desire and long-term commitment, and
how do we handle all these contradictions?
Right.
And that our identities are changing. And that whatever concept you have of me and whatever concept I have of you, they will be undermined by the real, let's say.
The longer you're with someone, the real can't not come forth.
Right. The real's constantly changing, it's constantly moving. Like we're talking about this energy, which is kind of like an organism, or like it's alive and it's moving and it's shifting and it's this you know, I call it the libido, you know, this life force, which is, you know, it's on the one hand, it's not a concept, but at the other hand, it's integral that we think it with concepts, but the concepts themselves have to be moving. Like you got to, like your concepts have to be, you have to keep thinking.
Yeah, you can't just stop. Yeah.
You can't stop thinking. And that's what I think ideology is. Ideology is kind of like when your concepts try to freeze or to make it completely one, like to make it completely one thing, right? So like you just say, this is it.
This is what's true.
We've got it.
Else. Yeah. we don't need to pursue anything further.
Right.
And no, it goes right back into the dating too. When the self-images freeze, they can't freeze. I remember there was something around this as well, which was when you're like, all right, I just want to be my most authentic self. And all right, this is who I am. It's frozen. All right, it's done. Put it away. Now I can do something else, And it's like it feels like this dating process is one in which you can't just find who you are and who the other person is and then just stay the same and remain together for 20 years. Like that doesn't work. And so it's like, how do you exist within constantly changing self-identities? Because it's not like you're getting to understand their true self more and more and more. It's like how we both understand what ourselves are constantly changing. They're never going to be the same. There is no understanding the truest self that doesn't change. It's like understanding the constantly changing self and being in existence or in relationship with that constantly changing self and constantly changing other at all times for long periods of time in the case of a long-term relationship.
Yeah, it's a constant dynamic between the self and the other. And there are, I mean, there's the possibility that for example, two individuals can sort of navigate that change over a long period of time. And there's also, you can't ever 100% get rid of the risk that two people might grow separate ways.
Right.
And that's one of the biggest problems with relationships, is that we are living in a time now where everyone is in a phase of constant growth and change. Like everyone wants to grow and develop. Right? Like, and everyone wants to have lifelong learning. Like everyone wants to be growing and learning for their whole life. They don't want to stop growing. They don't want to stop learning. Right? But that makes conventional relationships difficult.
Right.
Because if I'm growing and I'm learning and I'm constantly changing, and you're growing and you're learning and you're constantly changing, well, it could be that we grow and we learn and we change in the same direction. And it also could be that we don't grow and learn and change in the same direction. And it depends on, again, I think this is why dialectical thinking is so important, because with dialectical thinking, your thought is constantly changing, but it's always in kind of like a relationship between self and other.
So,
like
in that sense, is it possible to be in a relationship where you're potentially growing you're growing in different directions all the time, but you're constantly exploring the dialectical relationship between whatever, like wherever you guys are at that's not in the same direction? You're constantly exploring what is the relationship between those two separate things.
It's possible, and even in certain ways of thinking, probable, because if you're constantly dialectical thinking with a self other, and you have to be with someone else who also is thinking like that. But if you have two people who are thinking like that, or who are capable or open to thinking like that, what you both have that doesn't change and can't be replaced is your shared history. So like if you guys both value your shared history, and you recognize that shared history can't be easily replaced, or can't be easily, or you're going to be going through and duplicating a history like that with someone else if you leave,
right,
then you might be more willing to work through the differences that are emerging in your growth trajectory. It depends on how well you can think contradiction, and it depends on to what degree the difference is what I would call an incompatibility, meaning something that violates your fundamental value system. Right? Like, because if you can think contradiction, then you can accommodate differences and you can think like sort of difficult situations and sort of see, like, I would say, like the nuance in it, or like you can see it easily from the other's perspective and sort of make room to accommodate that difference.
Mm-hmm.
But there are limits to that. That's not an endless, like that doesn't, I don't think that expands forever. There might be incompatibilities that erode the pair bond and require a different type of structural thinking. Right. And there could be also a form of growth that leads to genuine enlightenment, in which case, in some situations, you'll find enlightened beings who are kind of so autonomous and self-satisfied. Like Osho used the word, I'm like one hand clapping. So like, I don't need a second hand to clap. It's kind of like, I don't need a pair bonded partner. I kind of like, my love is kind of a different geometry than that. So that's also possible. You know, and of course, I think the number of individuals that sort of get to that type of state of being is rare. I think, I don't know what the data is, but I've heard, like, for example, figures like Sadhguru, who's like an Indian guru, a yogi, who said, like, in traditional India, about 80% of people would be pair bonded in a marriage, and 20% of people would end up as yogis in sort of, you know, not in like a marriage state, but kind of like in a more, you know, like a yogi living kind of like in a commune with other yogis.
Right. That also feels very high. 20% is a lot of people.
Right. Well, yeah. I don't know if the data is reliable. I think I'm just remembering it off the top of my head, but you know, you get the point I'm trying to get at.
Most people end up in pair bonds. Absolutely.
I think.
And I think it's fascinating to explore this. How much can you have polar opposite differences while having compatibility, and when does the incompatibility creep in? And it's bringing me up to conversations or dialogues I've heard on ethics before, right? So ethics is like that which is worth loving, or perhaps I have this ethical core. It's like, all right, I have this thing, this core value, and this is like, I want to protect this core value is like pursuing that which is worth loving, the beautiful, pursuing the deepest service that I can to life and to the world. And it's almost like you can have compatibilities, but then as soon as like the other person is deeply in violation of that which is worth loving and that which is of service to life, it's almost like once that is in violation, then it's almost like, how can you end up being compatible in that case, when something so core to your approach and relationship to life is in violation? It's almost, because I've noticed this as well, like in the dating scene, it's like there's certain things where the specifics aren't different. Like I don't think there's like one person out there that's like perfect for you, right? But it's like, but there's certain core fundamental things where if that, I've noticed that has been in violation, and for me it's like, all right, this will never work no matter what happens, as long as this thing is in violation. And if this thing isn't in violation, it's like, all right, there's possibility that this could work, and let's see what happens.
I think this is like it's an interesting philosophical topic, is the question of what is value. Like what is what is value? Like for example, a figure, again, like quoting someone like Nietzsche, would talk about, for example, the transvaluation of all values as like the state of the overman or the highest man, or like the most enlightened person would be the individual that can create their own values. He was saying that in religious societies, the values come from religious texts and from divine authority and things like that. I think in the context of what we're describing, when we're thinking about, okay, the example you're giving, like I'm on a date and the other person sort of holds a value close to them, which is in complete violation or contradiction to my core values. You know, I think that it's interesting to investigate how values come to be. the origin and the core of like, where is the values coming from? Well, the values are coming from me, again, back to this energy inside of me, which is striving, moving, independent of what I think, right? But I should still be thinking it. And is the value that I think is core to me really my core value, or could it change? Is this person whose value seems in contradiction with mine really a contradiction? Well, it might be, it might not be. So you have to explore. You have to explore. And the reason why people don't explore this, and I think this is the reason why a philosopher like Nietzsche became so popular, is because in order to explore what my values are and to like know them for myself, you have to, in some sense, go through the limits of the pleasure principle, namely that you can experience pain. So like why something is valuable to me is because if I act in contradiction with my value system, I find myself in horrible pain. For example.
Right.
Potentially. Now there's paradoxes here, and we should be able to, if we were specifically having a whole podcast on values and the paradoxes of values, then we could go into those. But fundamentally here, I think what's interesting for people to think is the relationship between pleasure and pain, and the way in which the relationship between pleasure and pain conditions our boundaries. You know, like what we want inside and what we want outside, right? Like think about, for example, I think it's a value of mine that I don't touch a hot stove. Like that's a personal value.
Right.
I have another personal value that when I walk across the street, I look both ways because I don't want to get hit by a bus. Right. So you see, the values are pointing towards something related to the continuation, the extension of libido, the continued exploration of libido. And at the same time, in order to really be alive, and this is something also that Nietzsche emphasized, in order to really be alive, we have to, in some sense, do risky and adventurous things where our life can be on the line, right? Like, and he actually, that's one of the values of the overman for Nietzsche, is an overman is someone who's willing to be alive. And the paradox is, in order to really be alive, you have to take risks. Right. So this is, we could go down that rabbit hole for a long time, I'm sure.
as with any dialogue we start here, there's
all of these
so
things
many
are rabbit holes where you could go many ways.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
like for example, in a paper I was reading by Freud on World War I, he was talking about how if people are afraid of death, they don't live, and that they end up avoiding things that are essential for a healthy, growing mental life. Like, for example, going on an adventure to a new land, you know, like taking that trip to, you know, like, for example, in the context of our meeting, I was going to take a trip to Costa Rica, which is kind of, you know, it's risky. I'm going to a country I've never been to before. I'm going to go meeting people I've never met before. We were in the context doing an ayahuasca ceremony. So I'm doing a substance which is going to push me to the limits of my mind. All of these things are kind of risky. But at the same time, the motivation for me to want to do something like that was kind of to shake things up, get me out of my comfort zone, you know, rethink the direction of my life, to challenge myself a little bit, right? Yeah.
And this brings up, I think this is a good segue. Like masculinity.
Yeah.
How is masculinity? So masculinity, it seems like one of the core components is like risk, is like you have to be willing to take risks, step into risk. Like that's how I perceive currently one of the characteristics or parts of masculinity is being able to take risks and to step into risk consistently, even if it means potential death, right? That could come from it. And I'm fascinated around, all right, I think you've spoken on this in the past as well. In the last 2 decades or so, there's been like, or longer, or I'm not sure what the time span is, but there's been this like conception of masculinity, or there's been the changing conceptions of what masculinity is. For a while, masculinity is just like the largest physiological build, you know, for potentially, or like labor, or then potentially masculinity was there's like this going around conversation around toxic masculinity, around just being macho and repressing all emotions and never being able to feel any emotions. And then I've heard you were speaking with Javier, I believe, and there was the discussion of masculinity as soon as you define masculinity, you lost it almost. Like, all right, before we view masculinity, we put it in this box, like this is what masculinity is. And he was kind of defining it as like consistently going against a box of what society perceives masculinity to be, which helped bring up some ideas. But I'm really curious how you're personally currently understanding masculinity, especially in the relationship and context of what we just spoke about, which was taking risk, going and doing something which could end up in a philosophical death of self, or even physical death too.
Yeah. Well, like, okay, so like if you think about men historically, like I've watched some like documentaries and movies about various times in human history in the last few months, and it's crazy to actually think about most of young men's lives throughout most of human history, especially in the context of war, where dudes are en masse being basically sacrificed by a larger social entity. And they're being thrown into a situation where they know there's certain death. You know, like take for example, like the movie 300 is a movie I watched recently, like where like these 300 men, like they're fearlessly going into the slaughter. Like they know they're going to die, and even the leader Leonidas knows he's never going to see his wife and kid again. And like the last thing he does before going into the slaughter is take one of his best men and say, please take this letter or take this object of mine and make sure my wife gets it. So she knows that before I died, I was thinking about her. And the guy who was going off to do it was like, but I want to die with you too. You know, like he was totally like, he was like disappointed, you know, like that his life was being spared by this request. But we shouldn't underestimate the degree to which most men throughout human history have been in a sort of situation, perhaps not as extreme as that, but a situation that's also not that dissimilar to that. And today, in the last few years, I've been around men who are basically acting out this pattern, but through video games, where there's a number of men I see who are basically isolated in their room, playing video games that are basically virtual reenactments of 300, where they're basically going off into a virtual battlefield. There was one guy I was living with last summer who was for about 12 hours a day playing this game where he was just going around and shooting people on some battlefield in Russia. And that was his, like, that's what he wanted to do for the whole day. You know, so what, you know, when we think about what is a man, it's, I really think that it's something related to what I would call like a phallic drive. Now, that doesn't have to mean that you have a sword or a gun and you're going off and killing other people, or that you're actually just walking around with your dick and trying to impregnate women or something like that. Those are the raw unsublimated energy. That's the raw unsublimated energy force, right? Like that's like the raw energy.
That's
Like,
what you're describing as phallic energy.
yeah,
Or
it's like
phallic.
this, it's a simple repetition, like shooting a gun. Like, and you know, like when a guy like's on a battlefield, or like shooting, gonna shoot, or like guys go out to the gun range and shoot, they like get so much energy and so much joy from doing that. Or like go hunting, right? Like there's just like, there's certain type of guy that like just gets a thrill from doing that. Or like the dudes who do pickup, like they just get a thrill from going out and like asking girls for their number or something like that. Right? Like there's, it's a simple action oriented risk-taking. It's like you're risking your life. Like you've got this energy, it's an impulse, you're going, like, for example, like, let me give you the structure of like when I was 5 years old, I was addicted to playing Super Mario. So what is Super Mario? Like Super Mario 1, at the end of Super Mario, you get the princess, right? So it's oriented towards the feminine. Right? You want to save the feminine. You want to be with the feminine. The feminine is at a distance from you.
Just go through this long, challenging course.
Yeah, you have to go through this long, challenging course where there's lots of enemies in your way, lots of obstacles in your way. You could die at any moment. The cool thing about Super Mario is that if you die, you get to be reborn. So you're kind of safe, like, and that's the cool thing about video games, is that you can die safely.
Yeah, I get this sense of like this phallic energy being like moth to a flame almost. Like the flame is like death.
Yeah.
It's just like there's this like, even with like pickup, you know, it's like social, there's potential for social death or social like ostracization or whatever. And it's like they're continually wanting to just like fleet with like play with death in this super intimate way.
And that's why we shouldn't reify masculine identity as some sort, like, so now let me make a philosophical, I'm made a point in this podcast. I made a point in this podcast. I'm not making big philosophical statements like X and X statement about the absolute, like this is what the absolute is, this is what God is, this is what, like I know what this is, right? Like I'm not trying to do that, but one of the things that's important to me in thinking about these things in terms of our day-to-day existence is, and being real with it, is not reifying anything as like a transcendental archetype. So like thinking about masculinity as some like eternal, like some eternal perfection, right? So like when it comes to masculinity, I think much more it's like a moth to a flame, like you're saying. Like where I'm saying that what I'm trying to describe with this energy is actually your life is on the line and you could die. And in exploring this fully, like in other words, what I was trying to describe was really like the low level raw energy of it. But if you really cultivate it and you mature it and you grow it and you think about it and you philosophize, you become philosophical about it, you might cease to be a man. Like you might play with this energy so much that you stop being a man and you turn into something different. And I think that like that's what, for example, someone like an enlightened being, like, and I don't think an enlightened being is a man or a woman. Like an enlightened being is kind of like beyond that game and that energy. It's like that energy has transformed into something different now. It's kind of like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. Like, I don't know if that metaphor is a perfect metaphor, but it's kind of like a metaphor. Like you play with this energy, you explore this energy where your life's on the line. And like most men throughout history have been unconscious with it, right? They die in battle or they die somewhere, or they impregnate a woman and they have a child. right? Because that's also like, if you impregnate a woman and have a child, well, now your main task is to be a father, or you run away from the situation and you shirk responsibility. So again, playing with this energy is playing with death. Because if I knock up a woman, like, oh, I'm doing pickup and I'm sleeping with a bunch of women, say. Well, if I impregnate a woman, well, it's producing another entity, which now I'm responsible for, which now, if I'm really going to take responsibility for this situation, I really have to mature this energy into something different. Because I can't just keep going around doing that same thing. Well, if I do that, well, then I'm shirking my responsibility of being a good father, and well, then I'm just delaying my maturation. And well, a lot of men do that, but it's, you know, again, that's back to the ethics of this energy. But my point is that if you're playing with this energy in its raw form, you are going to encounter death in some form or another. And if you really mature this to its highest level, I think you ultimately, far from becoming an eternal man, I think you become something that's not a man or a woman.
That's fascinating.
And that's I won't do any more what I think about things, but that's how I'm trying to think about it. That's anyway how I kind of sort of experience the limits of my masculinity. I experience masculinity and femininity as like energy forms which they have a certain processual logic to them. They're not eternal. What I'm saying is they're not eternal identities. Masculinity and femininity are kind of like processual logics, which you explore, and then you could potentially die, or it's a possibility that there's an exploration of the logic where there's a qualitative transformation to something different.
It doesn't sound like you're talking not like a unification of masculine and feminine in a way that transcends them, or is that not quite what it is? It's almost like this.
Yeah, it is a dialectical relationship of masculine and feminine, because at least if I sense in myself what I mean by exploring so let me like stay close to myself. So if I'm exploring the edges of what my masculine energy is right now, I'm pretty sure it's bringing me to exploring the opposite of the energy, which is more of a feminine energy. And that if I were to explore that energy fully, it would undermine my masculine identity. And I don't think it would make me a woman, but I think it would make me something other to both man and woman.
Right.
And so what do I mean by that? So like, if masculine energy is this kind of like repetitive action driving outwards, I think feminine energy is much more receptive. So the classical distinctions are passive and receptive. So feminine energy is much more passive. It's much more receiving. So for example, I like using the example of like, if someone is constantly trying to make you think a certain way, that's very masculine ideology. Right. Whereas feminine is more waiting for you to inquire, what do you think? So like, if someone comes to me and says, what do you think? I'll let you know, but I'm not going around and proselytizing. Right? So feminine is much more passive, much more receiving. It's much more open to the other. Why? Because the feminine is what gives birth to the other.
It's almost as if unification is like masculine's always active, feminine's always passive, in a kind of simplified form. Obviously it's more complex than that, but it's almost like there's this relationship you can get to where sometimes the situation calls for being active, sometimes the situation calls for being passive. And it's almost what I hear in a lot of these game B meta crisis spaces, which is like, how do we best the world is so freaking complex. You're never going to fully mentally, conceptually understand and grok it to its fullest, to its deepest level. And so how do you have enough tools in your toolkit, such as being able to respond masculinely or from a feminine way, to sense into what reality needs in this moment and to react that way? And so if I'm sensing into reality, it like needs a masculine approach in this moment.
Yeah.
So it's being called forth. Oh, there's something, a masculine approach in this situation is not needed. It's a more feminine. There's a lot of masculine energies. I just need to be receiving it. It's like, yeah.
And then and at the same time and being true to yourself at the same time. So like also what the world needs, and also being true to sort of like the energy that you're exploring in yourself, because you can't, I mean, one of the I guess there are like pitfalls and traps of both energies. Like, and I think like one of the pitfalls and the traps of the masculine energy is that you might kill yourself and or you might become like an ideologue and like just keep on throwing your ideas at everyone, and no one gives a shit what your ideas are. But one of the traps of the feminine is that you can really lose yourself, right? Like, I'm just going to be receiving, right? You know what I mean? I'm just going to receive. I'm just going to be patient, passive, and then like other people like run over you.
I sense this is very present in my life as well, in the internet age, right? It seems like there's so much femininity, as in there's a certain number of people that are putting out tons of content online actively masculinely, and then we're all just kind of passively consuming it, and we're just kind of becoming morphed by whatever the beliefs of these people online are. I see like this has happened in my life so viscerally, which is why like there's so much energetics around it, which is there's certain people online that are very charismatic, and it's almost like my identity morphs to their ideas in a way, and I lose my identity in whatever ideas about self, other world are being presented in the intellectual web media in online. And
all of these are sexual relationships.
Mm.
These are learning, and knowledge is not delibidinal.
Right. And so it's like that's fascinating. Yeah. So that's like a feminine. And then now it's like, all right, how do I create more? How do I like do more online in the creative process? How do I cultivate the creative process? And then at some point it's like, all right, I'm creating so much. Now it's time to receive more and flow with this creating, receiving, consuming, creating, consuming, creating. And yeah, that just got me the all of this. These are sexual dynamics, or are these
totally.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Everything, yeah. To me, sexuality is much more like, in the way, so again, my ideology, the way Freud talks about sexuality is far more expansive than how we commonly conceive sexuality. Mm-hmm. So like let me give you an example. Like, so if you look at my YouTube channel, you might say, okay, like you're creating a lot of content, you're like your masculine force, like that's putting things out there for other people to consume. But if you look at the other side of it, is that my sort of passive receiving side is that I've spent years reading Hegel, or I've spent years reading Freud. Like, in other words, I've submitted myself to other men. Right? Like I've submitted. Like I submit to Hegel, or I submit to Freud. I'm like, okay, I don't know. I'm going to be an empty receiving vessel, and then I'm going to go into the masculine.
Right.
So it's very androgynous. The whole thing is very androgynous. I actually like that. I like that concept, androgyny.
Yeah. Which is not masculine or feminine, but somewhere in the middle, right?
Plato described it as a third category.
Third category beyond masculine and feminine.
Right. Or like a weird combination of them both, but it's not either of them.
Yeah. So I'm fascinated by this. I'm sensing, we talked about internet consumption and creation as one aspect of masculine and feminine. I'm sensing almost every interaction or state that we can find ourselves in will have this dynamic. Yeah. And so it's like, it feels like I'm super curious to explore just in my personal life, also, if you have any ideas, like what are some other examples of like, here are masculine, feminine dynamics at play in the world, and in situations where you might not perceive, your first thought isn't to perceive them as having it to be masculine, feminine dynamics.
Well, take a religious ceremony. A religious ceremony is incredibly sexual. I mean, you have a mass, or even a university presentation and a university lecture. And usually what's being done at a structure like a religious ceremony or a university lecture is that you're creating a container. Like, I think, for now, we can't compare the inside of a university to the inside of a church, because the inside of a church is so much more aesthetic and purposefully aesthetic than the inside of a university. But you're basically creating a beautiful interior. You're creating a beautiful container, which I think of kind of like a womb, in order for individuals sitting there to feel safe and to feel warm and to feel comfortable and to feel like everything's taken care of and that everything's just going to happen around them just perfectly. And then you have a very strong masculine presence get up there and speak the good word. Right? And the person who's up there speaking the good word is supposed to be someone you can trust. It's supposed to be someone that you can rely on. It's supposed to be someone who is speaking the truth. So it's in some sense of, again, it's a very sexual relationship. And now these patterns are historical. So, like, for example, at a certain moment in our history, religion was the dominant vehicle for the sexual relationship. Now it's transitioned into the university, let's say. And maybe all these meta-modern, like meta-crisis, meaning crisis situation, it might be that the university's now failing at this task, right? So the university was the vehicle for the transmission of truth and the creation of a sort of passive active sexual relationship between university students and professors.
And now it's going to be this complex, dynamical internet.
It's going to be something different.
Yeah.
It's going to be something different. We don't know what it is. That's the whole reason why these meta-modern spaces exist, because we don't know what it is. And we are kind of trying to feel out and explore out what it is. And I think that in this space, I'll say my point of view is that what's missing in this space is a discussion about the fact that what we're talking about is sexual. Like, we need to talk more explicitly about the fact that knowledge is not important independent of the libidinal situation, and that our knowledge is sexual. We're mediating sexual relationships. And so, like, I think what that means to me is like, we need to be much more aware of our unconscious, and we need to be much more aware of what's motivating our knowledge and what's motivating our desire to share knowledge and what's motivating our desire to learn. And, all these dynamics, right? Like, what's really motivating them?
Because what I'm getting from that is sometimes getting up in front of a Zoom presentation and speaking in front of a bunch of people is a very masculine thing. All right. Sometimes learning, if I'm super invested in just reading a shit ton and watching a bunch of lectures, that could be very feminine. Then could be this quasi, I forget what the word is.
Androgynous.
Like androgynous. Yeah. Where you're like in some sort of like half dialogue, half listening, like kind of Stoa-esque, where someone presents and then you kind of dialogue with them and bring in your masculine, and it's kind of this interplay of that. And Yeah, I've never heard it from this perspective. It's very, very novel.
Like okay, let me analyze like what's happening between us on this podcast versus sort of what I'm trying to cultivate in, like, for example, the Philosophy of Lack podcast, or the series I'm doing on my channel. It's like, so in the context of this podcast, you're inviting me onto your podcast, so the people that are listening to this have probably not heard me before and don't know who I am. So primarily I'm like, you're sort of setting things up to sort of either ask me a question or explore something about my knowledge. So you might say, as you as the host, you're sort of creating a container for me to open up in a more active way. So I'm in a more masculine role, you're in a more feminine role, but the context is sort of you reaching out to ask me to come on the podcast. And that's sort of like what a podcast setup is. And a good podcast host creates a good container for the guest.
Right.
With the Philosophy of Lack series, what I'm trying to do is create a kind of androgynous space. Because the reason why it's an androgynous space is because I wanted to create a setup where everyone sort of gets a turn to talk, and that everyone sort of has an equal time to talk and everyone has an equal time to listen. So it's kind of like, it's not like any one person is the center, but it's kind of like each person is sort of contributing to the whole, and each person is sort of having an active and a passive at the same time. And sort of the passive is active because hopefully while you're listening, you're thinking about how you would like to respond in your activity. So your activity isn't pre-programmed. Your activity is a relationship to the state of being passive. And like that, how can we create knowledge in a more androgynous way would be like becoming both active and passive in the way that we create knowledge. And also it's more androgynous because it's not like just like a podcast circuit where like you're just bringing on more and more people, a new person every time. It's like I'm trying to cultivate more a communal relationship where like
the same people.
where we're staying in a relationship across time, and like we're personally involved in something. Like that's what I also tried to do with the Sex, Masculinity, and God book. With the Sex, Masculinity, and God book, I was trying to sort of like build a knowledge relationship with two other guys that would span multiple years and become involved in community projects. In other words, it's not just knowledge for knowledge's sake. Like I guess that's the direction I'm trying to point, is like knowledge is not valuable in itself.
Only in relationship and context with that
relationship, community, personal relationships, cultivating those things, like basically trying to discover our real values, right? Like embedding our knowledge in like real communities. Like, and like when we think about like university system, well, the university system builds quasi community, but it's really not too embodied, and it's not across a lifetime.
Oh, not at all.
Not at all, right? So it's not really embodied in our family and our personal lives, right? There's a split there. So like I think like kind of what the meta modern space is trying to do is like, but again, I think we need to think more explicitly about that knowledge is sexual, and that we're libidinal creatures, and that we're libidinal creatures first and foremost, and that knowledge is kind of is secondary, and knowledge is amazing, but in service, right, to the other, to our real existential problems, like how do I feel when I wake up in the morning? How do I feel before going to bed?
How do I feel in relationship to other people in a community?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right. And we see this more and more. Like, I think, like, for example, we both know, like, Jordan Bates, for example. I had a chance to meet Jordan Bates for the first time at the Emerge conference. I don't know him very well, but he's an interesting figure to think about in this way, because if you look at like his personal and professional lives, they're kind of the same thing, you know, like he shares his personal life and his metaphysics
at the same time,
right? Yeah. At the same time, right? Like they're not split, right? I think that's a feature of a new a new thinker, right? A feature of a new thinker is that their intellectual life or their spiritual life or their metaphysical beliefs are not separate from what they're actually doing. Like they're showing you a picture of their newborn baby, and like you see like, oh, him and his wife, and you know what they're up to, and like where they are and the struggles they're going through, and you know the life path they're on. Like that's a lot different than a university professor.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it almost invites a sort of the personalness, because it's so personal. It's like, all right, it's not just this disembodied head on a platform giving me a lecture, you know. It's like you can actually dialogue, you can actually engage with that much more accessibly.
OG Rose, Daniel Garner, you said you had a conversation with Daniel Garner, or he has the project OG Rose.
Yeah.
That's another example of someone who's very much an intellectual, very much a serious thinker, but also very much embedded in the personal, embedded in the communal.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm super excited to see what types of communities and groups of practice and training and relation will emerge in the coming months and years, and excited to be a part of those. And yeah, man, I really appreciate you coming on for the podcast. Is there anything else you'd like to end the viewers off with before we head off?
No, just thank you for the opportunity to have this dialogue. It's been a good couple of hours. And if people want to find out more about my work, you can either Google Cadell Last, Cadell Last, or search me on YouTube. My main sort of interest is sort of thinking the connection between phenomenology and psychoanalysis. So if you're interested in those things, you might find that interesting to explore. And like I tried to emphasize in this talk, I think one of the major themes that runs through my work right now is the connection between the intellectual and the personal.
In the embodied philosophical is how I took that as well.
That's to me, that's the same. Yeah, two ways to say the same thing is the personal and the intellectual, and the philosophical and the embodied.
Right. Amazing. Thank you so much.
Right, man. Thank you.